When wife, mother, and school teacher Betty Gore is found hacked to death with an axe in a pool of blood in the utility room of her house, investigators first turn their attention to her husband, Alan. However, when Alan confesses to an affair with their friend, Candy Montgomery, suspicion immediately turns to the popular church-going housewife. And just when investigators think they've got this case all sewn up, Candy throws them a curveball they never see coming. Hello and welcome to The Dark Side of Love. I'm your host, Bianca Sloan, author of suspense novels about the dark side of love. And this week I'm putting a spotlight on part 2 of the case I'm calling Desperate Housewives. It's June of 1980, and investigators are desperately trying to make sense of Betty Gore's savage murder and make an arrest. The tiny town of Wiley, Texas is on edge, worried that a vicious killer is on the loose, and investigators want to put everyone's mind at ease. After questioning Alan, Betty's husband, including asking him whether or not he'd had an affair, they ask Alan to come in for a polygraph. Alan lies initially that he was faithful to Betty, but in the face of the looming polygraph, comes clean that he did indeed have an affair with his fellow churchgoer from Lucas Methodist Church, Candy Montgomery. According to Texas Monthly, Candy had proposed an affair with Alan on a late summer day in 1978. Candy and Alan played for the church volleyball team, and as the two collided on court one day, quote, for Candy, it brought a revelation. Alan Gore smelled sexy. So years into what Texas Monthly described as her, quote, very boring life with husband Pat, Candy had been entertaining the thought of taking a lover for some time. She wasn't looking to leave her marriage or fall madly in love. Candy just wanted to get her gong banged, as one does. Alan, who Texas Monthly described as having, quote, a receding hairline and the beginnings of a paunchy midsection, is intrigued by Candy, who, while not considered a cover girl, is bubbly, popular, and most importantly, up for, well, anything. By this point in the Gore marriage, Texas Monthly says Betty is as, quote, dour as ever, a startling contrast to the, quote, self-confident, easygoing, warm Candy. So when she says, why don't we do the do, after much deliberation and agonizing, Alan says, okay, let's do this. And just like that, Alan Gore and Candy Montgomery are having an affair. Some of the attraction between the two seemed to lie in the things that they had in common. As Texas Monthly said, like Candy, Alan was, quote, the outgoing, personable half of a mismatched couple. He did things Betty had no interest in, like organize the church's sports team, sing in the choir, and despite his outwardly plain appearance, Alan had a sense of humor, a contrast to the more uptight and anxious Betty, who had seemed to need Alan by her side at all times. Well, now investigators have a whole new lead to follow up on, and they bring Candy back in for questioning. She admits to the affair with Alan. She says that they would meet at a motel near Alan's office during his lunch break, and that Candy would pack a picnic basket, and that they split the costs in order to keep everything equitable, and agreed that nobody wanted to divorce anybody, and that if anybody started to fall in love, they would pull the plug. Candy says that the end of the 10-month affair was mutual, no harm, no foul. And once again, police give Candy the all clear. Except when Stephen Defebaugh, who was leading this investigation, compares Candy's fingerprints to the one print he was able to lift from the scene, there are enough similarities between the two to make him say, this is too much of a coincidence. He sends those prints out to an expert to get a definitive match, and he hits pay dirt. Candy Montgomery is now the #1 suspect in the violent murder of Betty Gore. Investigators want to bring her in for a third time, and Candy goes from being cooperative to retaining counsel. She is arrested on June 27, 1980, 2 weeks after the murder. Nobody can believe this. This sends a shockwave through Wiley. Candy is a church-going, choir-singing housewife, a petite woman, popular, never been in trouble. This is who murdered Betty Gore? As Texas Monthly put it, investigators also, quote, found it hard to believe that this pretty, vivacious, utterly normal suburban housewife could make such a vicious attack. She was a loving mother, a devoted wife, a churchgoer, and everyone's friend. And she wasn't putting on a cynical act. She really was as normal and likable and good as she appeared. The theory is that Candy was so desperately in love with Alan and wanted Betty out of the way in order to clear a path to him. Okay. Candy is like 10 months later, but okay. Candy is charged with the murder and she surrenders herself to the sheriff's office and is read her rights on camera, which they apparently had insisted upon. It's crazy. It's like a public lynching almost. When Candy is processed into the Collin County Jail, she has bruises up and down her legs, consistent with the heavy wooden handle of an axe banging into you. And they also see that she has a pretty nasty cut on one of her toes. So this was 2 weeks after the murder, and she's still pretty banged up. So, like I said, this whole thing, it's just a shock to people. And I have to say that one of the things that I really can't get over is that after she killed Betty, and listen, it is not in dispute at this juncture that she killed Betty, but that she left the baby alone, Bethany, screaming, hungry, covered in feces for 13 hours. That, again, is what I just cannot quite get my head around. And as Betty's sister-in-law, Pat Pomeroy, said to People Magazine Investigates, quote, she walked out on that 6-month-old child. To me, that became cold-blooded. I cannot disagree with Pat Pomeroy's assessment of that. Candy's trial commenced in October of 1980. 4 months after Betty's murder, and it was about as sensational as you can imagine. Nothing like this has ever happened in Wiley, Texas. There was, of course, a lot of speculation about what Candy's defense would be. Would she claim insanity? Crime of passion? Nope. None of the above. Candy claims it was self-defense. 41 whacks with an axe. Self-defense. Okay, understandably. Everyone is flabbergasted that this is the approach that Candy's defense team is taking, and all they can do is sit back and listen to what Candy's defense attorney, Don Crowder, called, quote, quite a story. Candy testifies on her own behalf. She says that she called Betty about picking up Alyssa's bathing suit and that Betty had asked her to come around noon. Well, this did not work with the very busy schedule that Candy had that day, so she popped over around 10 o'clock that morning instead. Betty, of course, is annoyed, like I think anybody would be. She was in the middle of a cup of coffee, she's enjoying the Phil Donahue show, and then here comes Candy knocking on the door. Betty had no plans for the day and was dressed in a pair of tight-fitting red denim shorts, a yellow short-sleeved pullover, and some sandals. She had her Singer sewing machine out, and the newspaper again was open to the movie section on the kitchen table. Candy claims that when she went to pick up the bathing suit, Betty had offered her some coffee, they chatted for a bit, she played with the 2 new dogs, and then out of nowhere, Betty asked her if she'd had an affair with Alan. While Candy says she copped to it, she also stressed that it was over and that she and Alan had both moved on. No one is really sure how Betty found out about the affair, whether she had any actual evidence or a lucky guess, feminine intuition, as we like to say. But at any rate, Candy claims Betty went out to the garage and came back with an axe. She then shoves Candy and tells her she can't have Alan. And Candy says, girl, I don't want Alan. Candy says that Betty then came rushing toward her with the axe and that they're fighting for it and that eventually she, meaning Candy, gets control of it. But then Betty gets back control, swings at Candy, and that's when she cuts her toe. This savage little dance between the two just goes on, and Candy claims that she tried several times to leave, but that Betty kept shutting the door in order to keep her captive in that tiny little utility room. Robert Udishin, Candy's defense attorney, muses to People Magazine Investigates that it sounds, quote, kind of like a bad horror movie. Yes, like Friday the 13th. Sorry, I didn't say that. Finally, Candy gets control of the axe and is screaming at Betty to stop. And according to Candy, Betty shushed her. And this, she says, was a trigger back to some childhood trauma where her mother had shushed her after an accident. And this is the moment that triggers Candy and unleashes this unprecedented rage, whereby she hacks Betty Gore to death 41 times. The defense has a psychiatrist, Dr. Fred Faison, testify to this effect, that when he put Candy under hypnosis in his office at an earlier time, all of this past trauma with her mother came rushing out. And as Betty lays in that river of inch-deep blood, Candy showers and walks out of the Gore house, leaving the baby, getting into her car, driving into the church, where Vacation Bible School was underway. Like nothing ever happened. She never called the police, never said a word. It is, like Don Crowder said, quite a story. Her other attorney, Robert Udishin, says Candy basically had a dissociative episode, a break, if you will, during the confrontation with Betty, and it was like, quote, she was watching herself in a movie. Yes, like Friday the 13th. Sorry. Nobody thinks that the jury will buy this. The trial, which lasts 8 days, concludes, and the jury goes to deliberate. Well, it does not take them long, just a few hours, in fact, to come back with an acquittal for Candy. This is yet another shock for the community of Wiley, not to mention Betty's family. Betty's brother Ron even said to People Magazine Investigates, quote, nobody in that courtroom believed that verdict. I don't even know if the defense attorney believed that verdict. Juror Alice Doherty Rowley gave the Dallas Morning News some insight into the jury's thinking, particularly as it related to the number of wounds, remember 41, saying, quote, we determined that it never had a bearing on the verdict at all, whether it was one gunshot or 1,000 whacks. 2 years later, Candy and her family pulled up stakes and relocated to Georgia. She and Pat, her husband, would divorce in 1986. Candy would change her name and eventually become a therapist specializing in trauma. Alan Gore got remarried to a fellow congregant, Elaine Clift, just 3 months after the trial. 3 months. 3 whole months. No grass under his backside. They moved out of Wiley to nearby Sash, Texas. Alan eventually turned over custody of Alyssa and Bethany to Betty's parents, and according to what the sisters told the Dallas Morning News in 2000, life with Alan and Elaine was its own sort of horror show. Alyssa, or Lisa as she's now known, told the paper that Elaine made her read the book, Evidence of Love, on the case, and that she had to provide her with chapter summaries. Good Lord. The girls also suffered physical abuse at the hands of their father and stepmother, often being denied food and forced to take cold showers as punishment. Their grandfather, Bert, even reported that Bethany came back from a visit with her father and stepmother with tufts of hair yanked from her scalp. By all accounts, once the girls went to live with their grandparents in Kansas permanently, they thrived. They became estranged from their father, who eventually relocated to California and divorced Elaine before he finally retired and settled in Florida. This is one of those cases people who lived in Wiley back then have never forgotten what happened. Others who weren't alive at the time have no idea about this bloody chapter in the town's history. And can you believe the Gore's house is still standing? It never got demolished, and several people have lived in it since then. And apparently, people who have lived in this house, they've just kind of shrugged their shoulders and said, well, it's a thing that happened. Nothing to see here, no big deal. Crazy. Pat Pomeroy, Betty's sister-in-law, doesn't ever want Candy to forget, saying that she continues to speak about the case because, quote, I don't want Candy to have peace so that she fools no one in the future. For her part, Candy, it seems, has no interest in revisiting what happened, at least not publicly. She has never given an interview about the case, and it is doubtful that she ever will. On the 20th anniversary of the murder, the Dallas Morning News tracked Candy down for her thoughts, and the message that she gave them was loud and clear, saying, quote, I'm telling you, in big, bold letters, I'm not interested. Count Stephen Defabaugh, the original investigator on the case, as one of those forever haunted by what he saw in the Gore house. As he shared with the Dallas Morning News, the eerie similarities around the number 13 in particular stay with him, with the paper reporting, quote, start with the Friday the 13th date. That was also the week in 1980 when the first Friday the 13th movie opened, featuring axe-spattered Gore. The Gore's house was the 13th from the corner. From the time of the death until the body was discovered took about 13 hours. From the day of the death until Montgomery was arrested took 13 days. And don't forget, the, quote, blood-flecked newspaper opened to the movie page and an ad for The Shining, a movie where Jack Nicholson's character famously hacks through doors with an axe. As Stephen Defabaugh told the paper about the Gore crime scene, quote, I think about it every June 13th. Thank you so much for joining me for another episode of The Dark Side of Love. I am your host, Bianca Sloan, and show your love for The Dark Side of Love by visiting thedarksideoflove.com for show notes and transcripts. While you're there, sign up for my newsletter to be notified about new episodes. You can also find a link to my Patreon page where you can access bonus material and other fun stuff. Learn more about my suspense novels about the dark side of love by visiting biancasloan.com. Thanks for hanging out with me, and join me next time for another tale of love gone wrong. I'll see you on the dark side.